Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's really a treat for me to be here with these two great filmmakers. We're going to be sort of in the moment, a little bit freewheeling. We'll try to catch some topics that sort of hew to what the theme is. We'll go along from there. I think we've got something queued up. Actually, I wanted to read a quote from. I'm going to read a couple of quotes. This one is from Robert Drew, who many of you probably know was one of the early what's the word? Midwives, I guess, or godfathers of direct cinema. And he said, great photography, particularly in motion pictures, is hidden in simplicity. Great impact, strong human character, the unforgettable moments of drama always arrive through your camera by means of the simplest and most direct way of seeing. I think that kind of echoes in Claudia and Tom's work. I've been fans of both of their work for a long time. If we can take a look, let's take a look at the first clip that Tom brought along, which is...
if I could introduce it just for a second.
Yeah, please. No, I was going to ask you to set it up.
So this is a film that's almost finished, called Can You Bring It? Bill T. Jones and D. Man in the Waters. And it's a film about a piece of art, the log line that we use, and if you've been in the process of making an independent documentary, you'll know the use of a log line is the challenge of art in the face of catastrophe. This is about a ballet that Bill T. Jones, who's perhaps our American's now greatest living choreographer, made in the 1980s in the midst of the AIDS crisis, directly after the death of his partner and artistic collaborator, Arnie Zane. And it does several things. It talks about the struggle to make that dance, and it talks about the ability of people now to find something in their lives that has as much at stake, perhaps in a similar way to the way people existed during the AIDS crisis, when we lost so many people from our industry as well as all the artistic industries in New York and all over New York. So that's the film. And its connection to In the Moment, each one of the clips that I brought have a different relationship to the moment. This one is spontaneity and improvisation, but in a controlled environment. So you'll see photography that is dance on stage, that is choreographed dance. You'll see photography that is dance from an audience point of view. And you can look at the difference between that and the difference in the way that it's approached. And then also a scene in a studio shot cinema verite of Bill T. Jones with the young dancers. So this is the beginning of the film.
Tom, what were the challenges of taking something that had been performance? It was obviously a very personal performance piece too, and bringing that into the current day.
Well, because the experience of doing the dance as well as choreographing the dance, Bill speaks throughout the film, but the dancers who were originally part of the company do too, but because the experience of actually doing the dance is central to the transformational character of the work on the people who do it, right? So it resurrects them. And it also resurrects the students, these Southern California, very sheltered students. It winds up resurrecting them too. But anyway, so I needed to show the dance from a dancer's point of view, not just from the audience point of view, which is the way you mostly see dance, or from a 3D the camera point of view where it's all constructed. But I wanted to make the viewer feel like they were part of the dance themselves. And so I had to, the problem with that is that this had to cut with performance material, and it had to cut with the same company performing the dance from the front, because it didn't only exist on the stage, it also existed as a performance. So it had to look like a performance and also be able to be shot on the stage. If any of you have ever tried this with dance, you will know that it's extraordinarily difficult because dance is mostly lit by side light. So every time the camera points into the wings, it flares because those lights are actually lighting the people, right? And that disrupts the shot every time you go around them. So we couldn't have that. So we had to create a new lighting scheme that looked the same as side lit from when you were on the stage. And that was the challenge of that. And then shooting the dance in a way that was like being a dancer with the dance, with the other dancers. And we did that wonderfully. My mother was a modern dancer, and so I've lived in the world of dance for my lifetime. And the other cameraman who operated, I don't think any of his footage is in that, but who operated the Movi, the kind of Steadicam type device. It was a Tortillo, and he is married to a dancer and has been filming dance all his married life, at least. So it worked, it helped.
Without getting too technical, can you talk a little bit about how the lighting changed for this, how you fashioned it?
Sure. I worked with my wonderful gaffer named Ned Halleck, who's just a master, and he's had a lot of experience with stage lighting, so it was a very kind of fluid and good relationship. And we worked out a lighting plot where the side light was lifted to what are called the pipe ends. So they're the ends of the horizontal lighting pipes, electrics they're called, that run over the stage. So instead of coming in straight from the side, it came in at an angle high enough so that we could keep it out of the lens most of the time.
What was your choice of equipment for this to shoot it on, lens-wise and everything?
I'm trying to remember. We shot the slow-mo on an Amira. We shot the Movi on an Alexa Mini, and my handheld work, which is pretty much what you saw there, was on a C300 Mark II with, I guess, the 17-55.
Was it stabilized?
No.
Oh, wow.
Just by me.
Yeah. So what were you saying was the trickiest part was because you had footage that was shot in the late 80s that was going to be interwoven with that?
Right. But we needed to, the audience needed to know the difference, right? That's why we made it clear in this clip which is archival and which is not, and we took the color out of the archival in this. Later on, when you see it, the color is back in, but it's identifiable and people know what they're seeing. So, yeah, I mean, there's some very powerful historical moments that are archival, and the quality of the footage pretty well tells you what it is.
Right,
I don't think,
right.
I mean, we've done a fair amount of test screening of this. We've never had anybody be confused about that, so I guess we managed to do it.
Yeah, it looks beautiful.
Thank you very much.
You talked briefly about I think you mentioned it when you're talking to your students about or there was an SVA piece that because you teach at the master's program, social doc master's program SVA.
Yes.
And you talk about articulate images.
Yes.
Can you refer to that a little bit as it relates to the piece we just saw?
Okay. So it's not my word. It comes from a senior director who, unfortunately, because of his time in this world, had to make his career in the field of sponsored documentaries. So most of what he did was finding either companies or nonprofit institutions, but I think it was mainly companies to make films for. He's one of my first directors that I worked for, and he wrote a book about filmmaking, and his name is Lee Bobker. His name was Lee Bobker. He's died maybe 20 years ago. But he invented the term articulate image, and it stuck in my brain because it really meant to me what I was trying to do my entire life and what I continue to try to do, which is that it's an image that uses all of our technique and skill at the surface of the story. So it's not meant to be an image that calls attention to your style or your particular virtuosity as a camera person, but it's an image that works at the service of the film and the story that the film tells. And I tell my students to make that their goal too.
Pretty cool. Let's move on to the next clip that you brought along, which is from The Last Emperor. Would you please set that up for us?
Right. So this is a film about the designer Valentino. The film was called Valentino the Last Emperor. The director was Matt Turnauer, whose most recent film is Where Is My Roy Cohn, which is a wonderful and very current film about this character in American history, recent American history. This is a film about Valentino, who's an extraordinary character who his life spans the period from artisanship in design, where clothes were made by hand for the very, very, very rich, to a time where there is no longer the economy for that. It's still made for the very, very, very rich, but not with the same beauty of artisanship and skill. So this is the end of his tenure at his design firm, and he's doing it with his partner of almost 50 years, Giancarlo Giametti, who was his lover and isn't anymore, but is his business partner and is his kind of the person who's really helped him become what he is and stay that way. And this is the element of being in the moment where you don't know what the moment's going to be at all. This is really improvisational cinematography. It begins with the creation of a dress, which is then brought to Paris from Rome, and you'll see that he and his partner, it kind of sets up the relationship with he and Giancarlo. And then he goes to an event in which he's given the order of what are you made when you're given a little red button and you're
The Legion.
the Legion of Honor, Légion d'honneur.
Right.
So he's given the Légion d'honneur in France, and so you'll see what happens. But when it's done, I'll tell you a little bit about what I faced to try to make this happen in the moment and to capture it.
Well, speaking about a moment.
So this was a moment that we started in the basement and we got to the balcony. So you notice that he walked in this door to a kind of fancy living room, and was the kind of green room area where he did a grip and grin with the Minister of Culture of France. And of course, we felt we really needed that. Of course not. So instead, we knew that there was going to be a scrum, the usual cluster of press people in the room where the award was actually going to be given. So I said, please put a production assistant right in the middle in the front so I can get a shot. And the sound man said, please take this radio mic and plug it into the mult box so that I can get a signal from the microphone. And so we get done with the grip and grin, and we run into the room where this whole thing is happening. And of course, there are no production assistants anywhere. So I push my way to the side. There's no way I'm going to get in the front, but I figure if I get to the side, sometimes that's not a bad shot. And I'm there, and you see one like 2-second piece from that position as he begins to talk. But I look next to me and I see, oh, that's the company, the Valentino company cameraman. He's there, he's getting that shot. So I'm gonna go back and get Giancarlo. So I make my way to Giancarlo and I start to shoot him. And then I hear Valentino begin the wind up to thank people. I'm at the back of the crowd. There are 25 people deep between me and the front of the scrum of reporters. And I take this little LED screen and I flip it down and I throw the camera up in the air. And I got the shot. He's there. So I zoom in a little bit and thank goodness for image stabilization. I can hold it. And so he starts, and then he begins the wind up to Giancarlo, and I whip around to Giancarlo, and he's there. You see that I have to find him. And then it goes on, and then he begins to cry again, and I whip around again. Anyway, it was absolutely by the seat of my pants. It was like hanging on the cliff by my fingernails.
I'm assuming you didn't know he was going to give a tribute to Giancarlo.
I thought he wasn't. I mean, that's what I was preparing for, was Giancarlo being bitter, because that's the way he'd been all the way through. So to have Valentino break down in tears, I mean, this is something just doesn't happen, and to have him cry and connect in that way across a whole crowd of people, I mean, it actually wound up to be the best it could possibly be. So sometimes the documentary angels give you what you need.
Well, also, it was did I read correctly that this was basically his goodbye, his swan song, and that was not, you did not know that ahead of time?
Not this day. There was a celebration of 40 years of designing in Rome that the whole film leads up to. That's the end of the film, and that is his swan song. Then his company is taken over by one multinational and another multinational, and it disappears into the conglomerate stew, and that's the end of his involvement with the company.
But that was kind of a strange timing that it just happened to
we had no, and in fact, when we started out to make the film, we had no, the drama was his relationship to Giancarlo and coming out, because he'd never admitted that he was gay and that this was a gay relationship. So that was what the film was basically about. And in the beginning, we stayed away from this other company that was slowly eating up his company because we didn't know what it was about. And then all of a sudden we saw, oh my God, this is the story. So the editing challenge for Bob Eisenhardt, who cut the film, wonderful editor, who cut the film, was to take that story that we really only began to film toward the end of the process of making the film and pull it backwards chronologically so that it kind of weaves in and out of the film so that you get little hints of what's going on.
I think we're seeing the plastics piece.
Potentially.
Yes? So could you set that up for us?
Sure. So this show is called Activate. It is a Nat Geo show, and it's a 6-part mini doc series. And the whole aim is to kind of create an activism that everybody can join into through an organization called Global Citizen. And it's an app that you can download, and Global Citizen works very closely with a lot of governments around the world to end extreme poverty. And so they have different campaigns around the world that they focus on. In the Philippines, it was plastics, and how plastic ultimately leads to extreme poverty, especially in the Philippines, where most of the income is through fishing. And the livelihood of many, especially those who are very, very poor, depends on fishing. And if they continuously basically just catch plastic, then that is certainly has a huge impact on their lives. And there are many other shows. One was about sanitation and water, clean water access in Nigeria, where ultimately, you know, the issue was disease-borne illnesses through contaminated water and not having any provision by the government for clean water in many parts of the rural, you know, surrounding of big cities like Abuja. But let's focus on Activate on the plastics in the Philippines, and yeah, let's go.
Okay. Let's take a look. Thank you.
So it's interesting because, you know, I've did not quite remember that this particular clip did not include all the water, you know, and the fishermen that we were that we have in the show. And so, you know, it just shows you a moment in time when clearly Darren Criss is been asked, who is an actor and who is very active in terms of social issues and participating in this campaign, becomes our motivation for especially global citizens to engage, because he has a huge, you know, following on social media. So he ultimately ends up posting through his iPhone what he's doing, and then, you know, it gets such an incentive sent through the likes and, you know, the link to participate. So in this clip, it's really interesting because it is, for me, just following the action, not knowing what's happening. You have to understand that this particular show was very tightly scheduled, but the way it was scheduled was like, okay, you know, we're going to be at 4 o'clock or at, you know, whatever, 10 a.m. in the morning, we're going to be with, you know, Esther doing the garbage collection, and then at, you know, 11 o'clock we're going to be here, and it was very tightly scheduled. And I had not been to the location, so there is just not knowing what you're getting into. You don't know how the light is going to be, what road they're going to go down, and so it's very, very spontaneous. And the challenge is in those scenes to be very reactive, but yet ask yourself consistently, is this shot going to further the story? Will this be impactful enough for the audience to really identify? Is this more about character development? Should I linger longer to find an emotional beat? So it is that constant, you know, thinking of, where do I move to? What is my best angle? How do I really capture what's going on? What is the essence of what's going on? How long is this going to go? And even though that each moment that I photograph is in my head like, this is the entire movie. That's how I approach it. This is the entire movie. Make sure that I get every single possibility, because I don't know in the end of how the editor is going to sculpt it. And it is very different when you're doing cinema verite in a very unpredictable situation, where you know for a television, you know, news show that they will, you know, compress it. They will not give it the breadth that you have in feature documentaries, where you can truly be with a character and allow to have that, to take that moment and really enjoy the silence with the character. In television, often it is more compressed, and therefore the thinking is different. It's much quicker.
What brought you to this project?
Well, you know, I had been working with the executive producer for a while. I know him for 20 years, and so Craig Detrone asked me and said, like, this is, we're going to go and fly around the world, and we basically are going to be in every possible slum that we can get our hands on, because this show is about extreme poverty. And for me, when I do documentary work, what is most meaningful is when I have something that, you know, where my heart sings. And I think, for me, documentaries are all about giving voice to those who are in need, who won't have the possibility to be heard. And what better way to make a show about extreme poverty, where we are constantly trying to help, but not really truly understanding what feeds into it. So there.
That's wonderful.
Thank you, Tom.
No, I mean, to me, that's kind of cuts to the core of what I believe we do as documentarians, which is to stand up for the grandeur of people, no matter where they are and what they do. That necessarily means taking a social stand in one way or another. So that's yeah, you said it beautifully. I wanted to ask you about the editing piece. Jim and I were talking about it before in the green room. You mentioned all of the elements of the scene for the picture, but are you thinking about what's going to cut at the same time?
So it's really interesting that you're asking that question, because of course in my head I have a perpetual list of shots of how they could potentially work together, and what am I missing to create intimacy, or what am I missing if it is a scene that's really let through body language. And so all of these elements play a big role. And so, you know, I think I take the lead through what's happening in the moment, and instinctively go to, oh, this is a very sensitive moment, and I need to particularly capture that in a more intimate shot. I really need the audience to have the sense of being there, which is very different from when you are placing your camera more in an observational way. I mean, of course, we are observing what is going on, but I think with especially highly active scene, my tendency is to place the viewer, which ultimately I am their eyes, into the scene, so it becomes very visceral. Whereas when I am observing, I would be further away and giving a scene more privacy. And in this particular show, that was not my intent. It was from the get-go, I want people to really be part of it, because the whole aim will be to create activism along the lines of really seeing and experiencing it firsthand. And therefore, my edit list is highly motivated by that. But I want to tell you one other thing, which is when I work, when I do my cinema verite, I actually move very much like a dancer. And the reason being is that I actually studied modern dance with Martha Graham and Eric Hawkins and Mary Anthony. And so
Who my mother danced with.
yeah, so it is quite funny to me that, you know, I see myself in a way moving about as if I am dancing a pas de deux.
Right? Oh, that's wonderful. It's wonderful. I mean, I do the same. So and I need to tell you that Claudia and I, and 4 other wonderful camera people, one of whom I've named today, are part of a group called the Camera Collectif, and we all look. Our footage looks a lot alike. That's all I gotta say. We all have our differences, and sometimes we argue about them. But more than not, we have this uniformity of style, which we're all very proud of.
Yes, and because we are very passionate about what we're doing, I think that the key part of making, impactful films or, doing great cinematography is that you're looking for a way to, tell the story visually without too much explanations, and that passion really feeds me, and that's also what inspires me.
I want to go back to this thinking, how you think when you shoot, because what I tell my students that you have to have 2 tracks running in your brain, and that's oversimplified because those tracks have many subtracks, but they're 2 kind of counter, really almost antithetical rivers that are running through your brain at the same time. One is the openness, vesselness, presentness to the scene itself and what's going on, so that you can feel things that aren't said. You can predict things that are going to happen that aren't clear, that you can feel emotions that are about to happen. And the other is a very rational, so that's a very kind of almost irrational and intuitive river. The other stream is one that's very rational and has to do with, what ISO am I shooting at? Am I exposed correctly? And then all the editing questions. So in that stream for me is an editor who's in there and who I talk to all the time. And so the editor says to me, "Did you get cutaways? How about a reaction shot? Did you set the scene?
Did you cross the line?
Did I cross the line?" I don't worry about that all the time. I know there's ways for them to cut away from it. Just give them enough close-ups and cutaways, and they'll be fine. And you have to do both, because if you forget about one, you're lost, and if you forget about the other, you might as well not be there. So it's a real trick, and it takes a lifetime to figure out.
You mentioned you mentioned TV, and I think there are obviously constraints, like you said, about the compression of time and so forth. Why don't you two talk a little bit about the difference in, when you're shooting for TV, you're not necessarily working with an editor all the time. So what is that like as far as pressure on what you're shooting, or if you're shooting anything differently, then you know that it's going to be compressed and you may not have input?
Well, if I may take the lead, Tom. I think that television, what I learned was a big steep learning curve for me when I did my first TV documentary show, which is basically, as I said before, in a feature documentary you have much more breadth, and you can really develop certain beats in a much different way for the audience to connect to and have that emotional connection. When you do a television show, you are lacking that space, and sometimes it becomes, in terms of storytelling, just very dense. And so I have learned that my cinematography therefore changes, whereas I can be much more lyrical in a feature documentary, but in a television show, I will actually ask the EP or the story producer, how much time do you think we'll spend in the overall show on this particular scene that we're shooting? And they will give me a time frame. So like, about 30 seconds, or maybe a minute and a half, but definitely, this is just for the third act, probably a minute. And so that informs me that if I am emotionally connected to something that I discover, because in a way, when you go to an unpredictable, into an unpredictable scene, and you are like the explorer of that moment, that and you discover something, then you know where you want to spend your time, because that becomes emotionally relevant. And especially when scenes are so compressed, I think the emotional value is really, really dominant for me.
I'll just relate an experience I had this year. It was one of Bravo's forays into producing a long-form documentary, but it was shot like a television show, which is, you know, in under 15-minute segments, 12-minute segments. You begin by what's called teeing off. That is, you're going to tell them what you're going to show them. Then you show them maybe 7 minutes of what you've shown them, and then then you tell them what you've told them. Then you tell them what's coming up after the break. Then you go to the break. I mean, it's mind-boggling. I know you all know it. It's part of your lives, but I've tried to stay away from it as part of my life, but it doesn't work very well. Anyway, so one of the things that we found when we were shooting, and this was a film about child brides and people getting married off in the United States when they were 12 and 14 years old and stuff like that. And so there were scenes with families where we had to shoot little scenes, but the scenes had to be little scenes, and so reactions became more important. It had to look a little bit like reality television, where you're cutting on people's reactions all the time because there's nothing to show. But here, in order to compress the time and compress the scenes, you couldn't do the normal cinema verite. Who do I stay with? Do I stay with the reaction? Do I stay with the person saying it? Because the saying it was really important. You couldn't play that over a reaction, but you had to get a reaction. So it made the constraints and the kind of shooting for editing a lot more rigid. It was really interesting. It was very tough in the beginning.
But you know, there's one thing that I find is really fantastic about today's access to shows, right? When, for instance, on Nat Geo, when Activate was shown, we had 5 acts and there was commercial breaks in between. But then now it's on Hulu and you can see the entire show without commercials. And so you have a whole different experience because you're not being ripped out of the continuity of the story. So then it becomes more like it has potential for you know, that experience, a more intense experience. You know? So I'm happy that that is at least available these days, where, you know, in history, you know, you wouldn't have that. You would have you would cut to a cornflakes commercial. You know,
the harder place is if you're directing or producing and you've got a feature-length thing and they make you conform it to television, and so you have to cut, you know, 7 minutes out of it. That's where you begin. Then you have to break it up into, you know, and then it becomes like cutting up your body. But
well, let's move back to feature documentary, shall we? Claudia, let's set up your next clip that you brought, which is from the film that's, I believe it's not out yet, right, on Claude Shannon?
Yeah, it's called The Bit Player.
The Bit Player.
Yes. So the feature documentary called The Bit Player is it's a biography on Claude Shannon, who was a genius mathematician. He died in 2003, and the story is that he is the grandfather of the digital revolution, of how to communicate, and he was the one who basically coined the phrase a bit. And so math is, of course, very dense. How do you tell a story about math without overwhelming the audience and keeping it emotional? You know, so part of the problem that we had with that particular documentary was that there was no archival footage available, or very limited amount of archival footage available about Claude Shannon. There was audio material available, but again, not enough, and a lot of print material. And so the director from the get-go said, this is going to be tricky because either I'm going to use animation, but that might not really bring across what I want to bring across. I think I have to, involve reenactment. And when you involve reenactment, that is always a tricky thing because a documentary, or those who are pure at heart about documentaries, will throw out their arms and like, no, not a reenactment. But in order to tell the story and really give the audience an idea of where he came from and how far he kind of, or how his character developed in terms of his discovery and his playfulness with math, we needed, that kind of element. And so we parted it into different time zones of his, development. The 1920s, which we approached in the sense of silver printing, black and white, and then the 1940s, where he fell into a big depression, and so we used some of the techniques of cinema noir. And then in the 1980s, when he was pretty much at the height of his career, and that was kind of Kodachrome, and then all of that intercut with modern, look of today's, saturation and contrast and, 4K raw material where you can really elevate the details and make it very lush. So what you're going to see now that you have a whole, story on the bit player is just a tiny little example, which does not have any cinema verite. It only has interviews and a black and white moment in terms of the reenactment. So let's take a look.
So I have a question. Was Sinan an actor? Was he an actor, or was that? Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, I have to say
what we did with the dolly.
One of the things that I just noticed that I don't know if you saw it this way, but what the monitor that I'm seeing is quite set to very bright. It is, the film itself is it's much darker.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
But
I just want to for all the camera people out there who are kind of just figuring out interviews, which are so much harder to do well than you think, than we all think. Those were perfect interviews. Absolutely perfect, beautiful interviews.
Thank you, Tom. Yes.
Gorgeous.
Great. What do you think? What was your big challenge in this? And that sort of leads me into the reenactment thing that we talked about before. You both have done them. Tom, you did one for one you mentioned before on Dolly Madison for PBS, I believe.
Yeah, well, we did a Muffy Meyer and Ellen Hovde and I did about 5 films about the 18th and early 19th century, and there's very, very little visual material at all. So we had to find ways of reenacting, and they're very similar to this film.
And one thing I didn't know before we talked initially was Tom's got basically documentary in his DNA. His dad was a very well-known film editor and filmmaker.
Yeah, he was a director mainly, Leo Hurwitz, and too few of you have heard of him. And we will have a website up devoted to him not long after the first of the year, a very big website with all of his films, a lot of interviews, a lot of material about his collaborators, and on and on and on.
But I mean, you had told me that your dad did
so
the first, if not the first.
So I'm not sure that you know, but the documentary in its present form, the social documentary, was invented here in New York City, a couple of miles from here, between 1931 and 1942 by a group of people, somewhere between 30 and 50 filmmakers, and very political filmmakers, because that was where the documentary grew. And the culmination of this work was a film called Native Land, which was co-directed by my father and the great still photographer Paul Strand. Paul did the cinematography. My dad edited it, and it used, because it was a film about the struggle to organize unions in the 1930s, and the forces, illegal, many of them, that were arrayed against the unions. They had to do a lot of reenactment, and because cinema verite didn't exist, and so they invented reenactment, which had only been used in very crude form by Time in a series called The March of Time, but this was the real thing, and the scenes were very powerful, and the actors came out of the group theater in New York, and Paul Robeson was the narrator, and the music's by Mark Blitzstein, and Paul Strand photographed it. It was really quite an amazing film, and you will get to see it at this website.
So where do you both come down on it? Do you think there are times when it's inappropriate?
Of course. I had this conversation actually with Michael Epstein at school. I don't know that there are any rules. He has some rules for when reenactment works and when it doesn't work, and I can't quite figure that out. There's sometimes when you really need it, and if it doesn't take over the film, if you're not watching performance, but instead allowing the film to flow through the reenactment the way it does here, then I think it's useful.
I think that reenactments can really bring an emotional understanding to a situation. Like, for instance, do you know the film The Imposter?
Yes.
And in The Imposter, I don't know who might have seen this film, but in The Imposter, it is a quite the imposter itself is tricking a family to believe that he is the long lost son that went missing when he was 12. And so they buy into it because he's been found, and through circumstances they're being reunited. But he tells the audience with direct address from the get-go that I am an imposter, and this is how I went about it. Mm. And because it is a circumstance where obviously you weren't there, and it's very hard to tell, there are all these reenactments, and these reenactments are very, very cleverly, crafted, where it really gives an idea of of how he manipulated the situation. And I think in circumstances like that, it is an incredibly powerful tool. But I also think that it has its place, and it has to really be joined with the story.
It can't be fiction filmmaking. You can't vanish into the scene. You have to have some kind of distance from it, because otherwise it takes over. It becomes fiction, and it isn't. I'm thinking of what is it? 3 Identical Strangers.
Yes.
That's another one where the reenactment is mainly done very well. I just think about the scene with the physicians and psychologists and social workers in this horrible institute that organized the adoption of these kids, and the experiments that were done, and it just it's like iconic. Just the shot of them toasting in the you can't forget it, because it fits right into the movement of the documentary and the story that's being told.
And I've seen quite a few films recently in the last year. One was in the Oscar doc shorts that was all animation, and I didn't know how I'd feel approaching that, but I thought it worked in several cases.
Yeah, it has. The animation segments can work very, very well.
So I think we're going to open it up to questions.
No, let me just show the
I'm
tiger. So this is my contribution to reenactment, although it isn't reenactment, it's enactment. So this is a film about a fellow who has now died just last year, named Alan Rabinowitz, who was the world's greatest protector of tigers and big felines, big cats. And his trip into this huge mangrove swamp between India and Bangladesh called the Sunderbans. And so I'm not going to say much more about it. This is the beginning of the film. And we used every tool at our disposal, every toy we possibly could to make this powerful because, you know, we took him to the Sunderbans. So you will see in this little sequence a big crane, one of the first uses of drone in a feature documentary. This was 2013. And Steadicam and a whole bunch of other stuff. So let's watch and we can talk about it.
How did you get drawn to that? That's such a cool story.
He's an amazing character. George Butler, who I've worked with for, I guess we started maybe 25 years ago, on and off, came to me and asked me to do this film with him. And I said, okay, but we're going to need a lot of support in a film that takes place in a swamp. And he was right there. And Kirill Birla, who was the producer, was wonderful in terms of providing everything that we need. I mean, the film was made from a big boat. It was one of the earliest uses of shooting raw with the C500, and we needed the amount of data that we were dealing with every day was extraordinary. We had to have an 800-pound robot made by light iron, which transferred what came off of the camera, the cards that came off of the camera, onto computer tape, which is the only way we could store that much data, because we were traveling by boat down the rivers of India into Bangladesh and back up to Dhaka. So it was, and then we had a boat that he lived on, and another boat that was designed as a camera platform that was big enough to support a crane. I mean, it was really quite an operation.
Really cool. Well, we've run a little long, as I knew was going to happen. So I'd like to get a little time to open it up for questions.
Well, on Activate, I had not only the producer and the director, because you know the way Verite is shot for me is 360. So when you're out in the field, it is very difficult to have an entire, you know, staff of people who want to see what you're doing behind you, because it impacts, of course, what's happening. You want to have a very small footprint. So wireless monitors are very, very helpful. And in Activate, especially when I was in Nigeria and I was in these little villages, there is no running water. There's, you know, it feels like as if you're 400 years in the past. And so bringing in a monitor that's remote is a huge attraction. So I would be filming the scene with a mother and them being farmers and going to the river and carrying all their stuff on their head and whatnot. And and around the bend were about 100 people, you know, the entire team from the US, as well as the entire village, with two small 7-inch monitors, you know, just glued to what I was doing. So in terms of stress and pressure, it doesn't faze me, because I have to literally forget all of that, because I got to be true to what I'm filming. So I don't try to even think about it. It's just like it's out of my head. They do their thing, I do my thing.
Thank you both very much for coming.
Thank you, and I feel honored being invited by you.
It is indeed. Big honor.